Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people as traditional custodians of the lands that I'm on today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I also acknowledge that we are all on Aboriginal land across Australia. Sovereignty is never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For those who don't know me, my name is Negar Panahi, also known as Negs. I'm the Principal Managing Lawyer of Balit Ngulu at VALS. I started my journey at VALS as a volunteer in a criminal practice, and I've since worked in various roles in the organisation. I made the transition to Balit Ngulu as Senior Lawyer in 2021, and I've been involved in significant advocacy, reducing the criminalisation of children and advocating for more diversion opportunities for all young people. Welcome to today's webinar. Over the next hour and a bit, we'll be delving into a topic that is very close to our hearts here at VALS. A topic that not only demands our attention, but requires our collective action. I'm incredibly grateful to see hundreds of passionate individuals dialing in today, ready to engage in a timely and crucial discussion. As we embark on this journey together, I urge you to keep in mind the true essence of Balit Ngulu, which means strong voice in Wurundjeri language. This isn't just a name, it's a testament to the resilience and determination of our children and young people. Balit Ngulu, that was established in 2017, stands as a beacon of hope, a platform where young voices are not only heard, but amplified and empowered to self-determine their own futures. The statistics are stark, reminding us of the urgency of the important work that Balit Ngulu does. At the time of Balit's inception, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people comprised of 17% of all young people in detention in Victoria. This reality is why Balit Ngulu exists today. It was born out of necessity, out of recognition that our children and young people deserve better. And since its establishment, Balit Ngulu has been a guiding light for many. It's a testament to what can be achieved when we invest in our young people, when we provide them with the support and the resources that they need to flourish. Positive bail outcomes, reduced recidivism. These are not just numbers in a report. These are tangible markers of success, of empowered futures, of young lives changed for the better. However, as most of you would know, our journey is far from over. Despite the remarkable achievements of Balit Ngulu, the countless case studies, the looming threat of funding cuts is a real threat to the future of our children. If we allow this program to falter, if we fail to provide ongoing support, we risk undoing all the progress that we've made in the past 3 years. This will no doubt have incredible and devastating impacts on not only our young people, but also the community. Today's discussions are about coming together as a community to advocate for change. Over the next hour and a bit, I'll urge you to open your hearts and minds as we delve into critical topics that demand our attention. The complex challenges faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people cannot be overlooked. And neither can the strategies for achieving positive outcomes and empowering our kids to self-determine their own futures. We must also recognise the significance of holistic, culturally safe service delivery. Our Aboriginal youth deserve more than just band-aid solutions. They deserve comprehensive support systems that honour their cultural heritage and identity. As we navigate through this webinar, I implore you to consider the actionable steps we can take to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal youth in the criminal legal system. Each and every one of us has a role to play in this fight for justice. Shortly, we'll play a couple of pre-recorded presentations that we've recently had with our current and former Balit staff members. They'll tell you about the challenges, the highlights, and how our service is more than just legal representation. Then we'll move on to our panel discussions with our live panellists. We're absolutely delighted to have Meena Singh, Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People in Victoria, join us on the panel today. Meena, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Meena Singh. I am a Yorta Yorta and Indian woman born on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that's where I am right now. So I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I acknowledge that wherever we are in this land so-called now as Australia, we are on stolen land over which sovereignty was never ceded. And thank you so much for having me, Negs, and for that beautiful opening.
Thank you, Meena. And of course, we also have VALS's own CEO, Nerita Waight. Nerita, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. My name is Nerita Waight. I am the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. I am a Yorta Yorta and Wurundjeri woman, and I'm also the Treaty Co-Convener for First Peoples Assembly of Victoria.
Thank you, Nerita. Before we get into the content for today, a content warning before we start. We will be discussing trauma, family violence, abuse, and racism. If any part of our discussion raises issues or concerns for you, we encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to call Yarning Safe and Strong, a helpline that's run by the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service. The contact details will be in the chat function. And for anyone to call Lifeline, those details will also be in the chat. We'll move on to some pre-recorded presentations, so stay tuned.
Hi, my name is Shanae Penrith. I am a Yorta Yorta Jar Jar Wiradjuri Yamaji woman, and I've grown up in Melbourne Metropolitan. And I'm the previous Aboriginal community engagement worker for VALS for the Balit Ngulu unit. I was actually once a little naughty kid myself growing up, and I had also AOD issues. I was also had experienced homelessness, like I was kicked out of home because of my behaviour when I was like 14. So that was the one main reason that I wanted to work with these young fellas in our community, because I was once like these kids. So I wanted to show that you can basically turn your life around and not stay in that same path that you're currently going down. I think the role as Aboriginal community engagement worker in the Balit Ngulu team is very important, because you're not only you're supporting these young fellas going through the justice system, but you're also like an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander support person. Like, it's a culturally appropriate worker to work with these young fellas. And also, I think it's important that the people in these roles also have lived experience, so these kids can relate to the workers, and like these workers can be like showcase that, you know, I've been there, done that, and it's not the life that you basically want. And when you do get given the opportunities to turn around and change your life, like take those opportunities. And I feel like it's important that like the Aboriginal community engagement worker is in the Balit Ngulu team is to not only support them through the justice system, going to court with them when they're attending court, visiting them while they're incarcerated, but also supporting them with any other things that they need on the outside. So when I was working with these kids, I basically dealt with them on a holistic approach, because I knew not only were they dealing with the justice side of things, I knew there was other factors at home that they were dealing with. So that's why I like to deal with these kids that I was seeing holistically. I think the positive part of this role when I was working in Balit was, I guess, building the relationships with these young kids. We got along really well, and then the kids would always ring me up and be like, hey, do you want to come and help me with this? Or like, are you up to come out and have lunch? So like, I just enjoyed you know, spending time with the kids and actually supporting them with what they wanted. When I first started, I got this client given to me, and she was actually a very headstrong client. She knew what she wanted, and she knew who she liked and who she didn't like. And then, yeah, I went to court one day to meet her for the first time. She liked me straight off the bat, and she was constantly reaching out to me for me to support her with writing resumes, helping her try to find work, cover letters, stuff like that. Last year, I won the 2023 Warwick Award Community-Based Employee. I was told to self-nominate myself and I guess put the application in, and at first I was a bit like, I don't know, like a bit shame. And then I ended up winning it, and then everyone was congratulating me, and it just showed that my hard work and dedication didn't go unnoticed with what I was doing with these youth in Balit. And the award basically outlines the positive outcomes and support that you're given to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in the community that you work with in the community sector. The advice I'd give to community would be to their carers and parents or whoever they might live with, to ring up VALS and ask to be referred to the Balit Ngulu team. The team basically wear their heart on their sleeve, and they're there to dedicate, and they're putting all their time and efforts to give the best outcomes to these young fellas going through the justice system. And the ACE worker like myself is there to be an advocate, I guess, and support them through the journey of going through the justice system. I still to this day think about the youth that I was working with, and they actually left an impact on me, and I hope that these kids that I was working with were still putting in the hard work and, you know, trying their best to stay on the path that I was helping them go down, and, you know, that they're not alone and there are support out there from our local ACOs. And I just hope that these kids end up on a better path and change their lives for the better.
My name's Singh. I'm a lawyer in Balit Ngulu, which is the youth specialist team.
My name's Ben McDonald. I'm also a lawyer in the Balit Ngulu team.
I think we make sure our clients feel valued and important by just sitting down and listening to them. And I think a lot of young people who are caught up in the justice system or the legal system haven't been heard and haven't been treated as human beings by a lot of services and by a lot of, elements of the system. So I think it's important, no matter what a young person has been charged with or whatever the legal problem is, that we sit down and we just speak to them and treat them like a person and value their humanity.
I think other ways that we ensure that our clients always feel valued and important is always making sure that they're aware that they're the ones that are making the decisions, that we're here to speak on their behalf in court and speak with the police, provide advice, but it's always up to them to make the decision about the direction that they want their case to go in.
I think one of the key ways that we empower the kids that we work with is allowing for them to have that self-determination, to be in charge of their own matters and get to the end point they want to. And one of the first things I say when I meet a young person for the first time is I explain my role and I tell them, look, you're my boss. I will give you advice. I will tell you what I think about the legal issues. And yes, it's important that you listen to what I say, but in the end, it's your life and it's your future.
We'll follow what they want to do. We'll always have their back. We'll be that constant support that remains consistent and always sticks by them.
What sets our service apart from others is that we look at a young person who comes to us holistically. So many of the young people we work with have very much fallen through the cracks, and by the time they get to us, they're in a sort of crisis mode. I think as a service, we do a very good job at helping them with their legal issue and trying to get outcomes to divert them away from the criminal legal system, but also helping them to address these issues that got them there in the first place.
Another way that our service is set apart from others, particularly regarding client needs, is that we have an Aboriginal community engagement worker in the team who can engage the young person to different referrals that might be specific for the young person. Through the work of the lawyers in conjunction with the Aboriginal community engagement workers, we try to develop a plan to work out the best strategies and ways to address the young people's underlying issues and work out the best way to move forward in order to try and divert them away from the criminal justice system.
When we engage with the young people, sometimes we'll do it on the phone, sometimes we'll do it on Zoom, but we do try and see them face to face. And Balit has now allocated our lawyers regionally. So, for example, I'm based in the Dandenong, Frankston and Moorabbin courts. And that means I have the capacity to, after court, or if I have an office day, to take the car out and go and visit those clients in their homes or in a place that's comfortable to them. One of the real strengths of Balit is that we have the capacity to do that, to do visits out where the young people are on country, in their homes, in their communities. What we do well is that we do take the time to allow the young people to, I suppose, tell their own story and explain to us in their own words what's gone on in their life and how that's affected them and how it's gotten them to end up where they are.
For example, if the young person tells us something like they've been injured during an arrest or they've been treated unfairly by the police, we can ask them if they want to be referred to the Wurundjeri Police Prison Accountability Team at VALS. Other things might include that if a young person tells us that they're trying to get a job or they want to get their driver's license, that we can refer them to the Aboriginal community engagement worker who can assist with those kind of activities. So while we're speaking to the young people as lawyers and we're speaking about their legal issues, we're listening to a lot more than that. And if they have any other issues going on, that we try and address them as well as the legal issues.
At Balit, we believe that courts are not culturally safe places for our clients and their families. And that's because, one, they're a colonial institution, but they're an incredibly alienating place, and particularly for a young person. Even in the children's court, where there are accommodations, there's still the magistrate up on the bench, up high. There's the prosecutor and the lawyer speaking on your behalf. You're packed in front of a courtroom full of people with everyone hearing your matter aired out.
For a number of different reasons, the criminal justice system can be quite slowly moving. Clients' matters might not finalise for a number of months. It's always our goal in Balit to try and have young people's bail discharged at the earliest opportunity. Once they're on summons, they therefore no longer need to come to court. And if their matter is not going to progress in a meaningful way, we make sure that they go to school or go to work instead. One of the really important ways that we ensure that our approach is trauma-informed is through preparing written submissions for some of the really significant hearings like bail applications or plea hearings. And through preparing written submissions, we can outline for the court the young person's personal circumstances. And a lot of the time, these might be quite traumatic. Rather than going over these traumatic personal circumstances again, we can rely on the written submissions, and we can ensure that the magistrate is in a position to understand the young person's personal circumstances and be in a position to make an informed decision when granting bail or in sentencing.
We have very good relationships with other services, both Aboriginal community controlled and mainstream, that work with our mutual clients, the young people. And that means that we can attend care team meetings, liaise with these services to get some background on the young person. So this young person isn't going through their traumatic history over and over again. They've spoken to one worker and now another worker, now to their lawyer. Now, they don't need to do that if it's in a report somewhere. They don't need to do that if they've got consent for that report to be shared with us. And you can learn about what makes them tick, what their triggers might be, what accommodations they might need to communicate or to get to court.
So our main goal regarding our clients' interaction with the criminal justice system is to divert young people away from the criminal justice system at the earliest opportunity. So what we'll do when we have a new client is we'll analyse the brief of evidence in quite significant detail before having a conversation with the young person about what they want to do with their case. If the young person isn't in a position to be able to get a caution, then we'll try and to seek diversion. And diversion is another way to advocate for young people to be diverted away from the criminal justice system and to engage with support services or employment or schooling. And this is a way to divert young people away from the criminal justice system and instead to re-engage with pro-social activities.
That was really wonderful to hear again. I was present for the filming of these discussions, but watching it again has reminded me that every person in Balit Ngulu, every person in this team shares the same vision and hope. every person in this team, whether they're a lawyer or an ACE worker, believes in the holistic service that we deliver to our children and young people. We'll move on to our live discussions with our panelists here. We'll start with Meena. Meena, I've got a few questions for you. First one is, as the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, you've been visiting Aboriginal communities across Victoria. What are some of the expectations and hopes for our children that you've heard during those meetings?
Thanks, Negs. I mean, it's one of the great privileges of my role that I am able to speak directly with Aboriginal children and young people. And, our remit at the Commission is very much focused on children in out-of-home care or getting child protection services and children engaged with the youth legal system. But I just get to talk to Aboriginal kids just about a whole range of things just by virtue of the nature of my work. And, all of the kids I speak to, or that they're carers, they're adults, the key people in their lives, all of the things they tell me is that they really just have the same hopes and dreams as every other child or young person in Victoria. They want to be safe. They want to be seen. They want to have fun, they want to engage in their learning, and they want to be supported to be able to achieve what they want out of life, what their dreams are. And, in order to achieve those things, they need to be heard. They need to have people speak to them with respect, to listen with respect, just about what they need in their lives, but also how they want to go about those needs being fulfilled. And they want to have the adults with power and authority in their lives make decisions that really reflect what they want. So, to hear from these videos, it's so important, the work that Balit does, just to front and centre the voices of Aboriginal children and young people in these incredibly onerous and incredibly difficult legal proceedings.
Thank you, Meena. I think Ovi also summed that up quite well in it. He said, we tell the kids from the outset, they're our boss. We're here to do what they want us to do, and we're here to elevate their voices. So we certainly agree with what your view is about how their things should roll.
And I think it's interesting because when I was a lawyer and I was representing people, the way I would explain my role is that all the court knows about you is what's on paper. They only know that you are alleged to have broken or committed this offence. My role is to bring you to life. My role is to tell the decision maker what it is about you that deserves a particular response that acknowledges what your life and your circumstances need. And the media does such damage when it dehumanizes children who break the law, who offend. Some of the headlines that you read are just as if, there's no humanity for these kids and there's no understanding of the experiences that these kids have been through. And I think our role, we have a collective role of rehumanizing our children and young people, of telling their stories fully and Balit has such a huge role in that, of telling the stories of children and young people before those decision makers so that the right outcomes are happening for our kids.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You've sort of touched on this already, but how do you think, from what you know about Balit Ngulu, how do you think we respond to these expectations that the community has?
Look, the roles of the Aboriginal community engagement officers is just so vitally important. I mean, they've always been a central feature of Aboriginal legal services, of VALS, 50 years in operation of Aboriginal legal services around the country that have been operating longer than legal aid commissions. The connection between the client and the lawyer that role plays, but also between the law and community is such a vital connection in terms of so much demystifying, but so much just being seen. It's, I love those videos, Shania and I've forgotten the other gentleman's names, just to see, Shania said it perfectly in her piece about just seeing the child in their fullest, seeing them beyond what the offending is, and also seeing what the offending is in context of that child's often incredibly complex life. And I think, that's the key of Balit, being able to unpack that complexity and bring, that culturally sensitive legal advocacy to deeply culturally unsensitive places. As one of the lawyers said, courts, our whole legal system that we operate now is a foreignly imposed, violently imposed legal system onto our country that, we didn't need for 60,000 years. We had ways of managing and governing and determining over ourselves that worked. There's such a gap traditionally between lawyers and clients. Being a lawyer is a very privileged role that we can occupy. You've really got to challenge your own privilege when you're a lawyer and you're acting for people who haven't had the same background as you had. And, I'm a big advocate for lived experience and how lived experience changes the way we do, some of our professions and how some of our professions work. And lawyering and the legal profession is just one space of that. Needs to be demystified. It needs to be deprivileged in lots of ways to actually respond to what a client's needs are. And, you can just hear the voices of your lawyers speaking about, the way you speak as well, Negs. I've seen you advocate for children and young people, for our kids, a deeply human and compassionate response so that our kids just aren't seen as paramount. It's fundamental to everything that we do.
Absolutely. And I think Ovi also touched on this, and Ben as well, in that we take off our suits, we take off that court gear and we go and we meet clients in community, whether that's at McDonald's or at KFC, or whether that's just a drive home. That's not something that can be replicated inside of a courtroom. So you summed that up really well.
It's core to engagement. We assume that people can get into the spaces that we occupy as professionals, or in buildings, or in, official type spaces, when the reality is we're the ones with the resources in lots of ways. And we're asking people with the least amount of resources, the least amount of agency and opportunity to do what they, to jump through hoops in order to engage with us. And it's really got to be the flip of that. It's really got to be about, where is my client? Where are they in their situation? I need to go and meet that. There was a point that Shanae was talking about, that young person that she met with, that young woman who liked her instantly and had that repeated contact. That trust and that ongoing engagement is so important. And it's really quite terrible that the only place a young person might get that is from their lawyer. In a criminal legal system, the lawyer is the person who's providing that constant ongoing connection. Whereas if there'd been that constant ongoing connection from, say, a caseworker or from a health service or school or wherever, that child might not have gotten into a situation where they're entangled with the criminal legal system and it's their lawyer that's providing the number one support and the number one service for them. So I think there's so much that other service providers can learn from the model that Balit provides in how they represent children and young people, that is just so transferable and just so best practice when it comes to our kids.
Absolutely. And it happens so often that our lawyers and our ACE workers are the core support person or persons for that young person. And it is one that it shouldn't be the case that your lawyer is your most trusted adult in your life. So we're hoping to change that by being around and, I guess, helping kids redirect. So my next question for you, Meena, is can you talk about the ongoing need for Balit Ngulu in addressing the challenges faced by Aboriginal children and young people in Victoria? You have sort of touched on this already, but if you wanted to add anything else?
Look, I'll be brutally honest. I wish we lived in a society where our roles weren't needed.
Absolutely.
I wish we didn't have to have a commissioner for Aboriginal children and young people, because the idea of our kids being mistreated in any sort of way, of being grossly overrepresented in child protection or youth justice, is just so unfathomable that we don't need roles like mine. And equally, I wish we didn't need to have services like Balit, because, but it is because we've had this colonial system imposed onto our communities, systems that were never designed for us, never had any input by us, and actually were used to criminalize us and to put us in particular spaces and places and deny us our right. And so, my role, Balit's role, it's all about putting our voices back into these spaces. And until we have systems that are truly decolonised, until we have systems that truly recognise the rights of Aboriginal children and young people, we're always going to need Balit, because, Balit does that culturally sensitive legal representation. Another thing we shouldn't have is an age of criminal responsibility as low as 10 years old. Well before I was commissioner, I was advocating for raising the age. The Commission's Our Youth, Our Way inquiry called for raising the age to 14. That was in 2021. Calls for decades, really, about this. Means that we shouldn't have to have these sorts of services for children and young people. I want to see instead services that support families, that provide stability in housing, that see kids connected with education, that see kids free of racism in education, all of these sorts of things. But when you don't have those things, that's when kids become entangled with the criminal legal system. And that's why we need Balit Ngulu. You know, we still have gross overrepresentation of Aboriginal kids in the criminal justice system, in youth detention centres, prisons. We know that the younger a child goes into prison, the more likely they are to stay entangled with the criminal legal system. So it's so vitally important from day one, an Aboriginal child or young person, for their very first offence, has representation, because we need to make, potentially examine the offences and make sure they're not being charged with, ridiculous offences, or if they are being charged with offences that are there, making sure that there's a response that is sensible, that sees measures put in place that address their needs, and ultimately avoid any sort of imprisonment, because you know how devastating it is. And the Commission's spoken about, concerns about isolation periods in youth detention centres and the impact that has on children and young people. So at every point of decision making, Aboriginal children and young people, all children and young people, need legal representation to challenge those decisions that are being made about them. We're in a position where it's questionable whether or not Balit will continue. I just find abhorrent. I find that, these are our most vulnerable children, and we're basically gambling with their lives. And I think also people don't realise how destabilising it is for an organisation when you don't know what happens in the future with funding. People want to know that they're going to be working into the future. The impact that has on people's ability to work and to stay in a role, impacts on turnover of staff when they don't know what the future is of an organisation, even if they're doing the work that they love. And it's so clear from Ben and Ori that they love the work. I just find it unbelievable that representation of children and young people is something that isn't an absolute priority.
Definitely. And I would challenge anyone who thinks otherwise to just come and see the work that our lawyers do, not just in court, but every day. It's without question one of the most important that you see in the sector, working with young people. And Meena, my last question for you is, what do you hope for the future of Balit, and also for the future of our kids more broadly?
So in our Youth Our Ways, so that was, the Commission's inquiry into experiences of Aboriginal children in the criminal legal system. And I deliberately say criminal legal system rather than criminal justice system, because I do not see justice in the criminal justice system, least of all for our children and young people. But in that inquiry, recommendation 65 talked about ensuring ongoing funding for Balit to do the work that it needs to do, to be able to go out and engage properly with children and young people, with its clients and community, to be able to have representation at every single appearance that needs to be made for a child in court. So firstly, I would hope that there is sufficient funding put in place on an ongoing basis without question. And I would expect that to be supported across the board. And then more broadly, I think Balit is a trailblazer in terms of practice, in terms of best practice for children and young people, in terms of culturally appropriate legal practices, to show people that it's not an either or. Either you get the good legal representation or you get a culturally appropriate representation. No, the two are absolutely possible, and Balit is demonstrating that day in, day out. I would hope that there's a take up in other jurisdictions of this type of model, that this practice is seen as so vitally important, and it's not just, it's nice to have, but to actually see that centering your client as a child, as an Aboriginal child, as a child with any sort of identity, lived experience, whatever it is, that takes a particular type of practice, and that practice is professionalised and held in esteem. And I think Balit just models that so brilliantly. VALS, 50 years, operating longer than Victorian legal aid, the knowledge of the organisation, the fact that VALS and Balit have to continually argue for funding is just mind-blowing when I think of the trailblazing services and modelling of work that the organisation has done. I just, I don't want to wish VALS another 50 years, ironically, because I wish we weren't, where we've been created as to address issues that we shouldn't have to address. You know, it's the strength and the brilliance of VALS that I want to see continue forever. And, you know, maybe not in direct legal representation, but in other ways.
Thank you, Meena. We'll move on to our next panelist, Nerita. Nerita, could you start by talking us through the establishment of the Balit Ngulu program?
Sure, Negs. It's funny, Balit Ngulu is the same age as my son, Mateo. At the time that I was setting up Balit, I was 7 months pregnant with him and building tables and chairs for the first office. And it's incredible that come this far. Like Meena said, it's disheartening though, because we've gone through 2 evaluations, both which have been overwhelmingly positive and talk to the impacts that Balit Ngulu has provided. But we've seen it mentioned in numerous inquiries, whether it be Our Youth, Our Way, whether it be URUK's interim report on criminal justice and child protection. And yet still we are having the same conversations. And in the context of the government having reneged on its promise to remove reverse onuses for children when it comes to bail applications, and now introducing tagging them through the use of electronic monitoring devices. But still, it persists. And it was in that kind of environment that Balit actually started. At the time, we'd come off the back of them talking about moving children into adult prisons, Barwon at the time. We were having the debate on raise the age. We were talking about a new youth justice bill. And then we had significant concerns around Aboriginal young people in the youth justice system who were being subjected to what we would term inhumane and degrading treatment. So the idea was that we would set up a youth legal service in order to provide our children with an avenue that was tailored to their needs. We were having clients come to us with heartbreaking stories, and one of them will sit with me forever, and which was a young Aboriginal boy. His parents had been removed. He had been removed. His grandparents had been removed. And he told me that it didn't matter what happened to him because he had no future. His parents didn't have a future. His grandparents didn't have a future. And therefore he didn't, because nobody cared about what he had to say. Nobody cared about what he wanted. He was just there like a decoration, or as he described it, like a doll. So I went to the CEO at the time and asked whether or not it would be possible to start Balit Ngulu on the basis of trying to give kids like that a voice, trying to instill in them that they're not puppets, Negs, that they're people, that they are individuals who have an ability to determine their own futures, who have important things to say, things that we need to learn from. Thankfully, the CEO was incredibly supportive about starting this up and put all of his energy into making it possible. So we started very small, and we were covering off both on the family division and the criminal division of the children's court, which meant that we had a real focus on children who were straddling both the child protection and the criminal justice system, often referred to as dual track kids. In all of those, we saw that there were issues around housing, education, lack of supports, family breakdowns, drugs and alcohol, family violence were the factors in their overrepresentation. It took a lot of time and dedication to get to where we are. And as Ben, Ovi and Shania touched on, Balit's holistic approach, which really requires from starting from scratch to understand the underlying reasons why young persons ended up in the position of requiring our service, has made it what it is today. So I'm hoping, like I'm sure you are, given you're the principal managing lawyers, that we'll continue to see the service expand, not only on legal services like Meena mentioned, but those real wraparound supports that the ACE workers and our disability advice and our response team workers provide to our clients.
Absolutely. And I think we've really grown from the core of what Balit started off as in 2017. We've just grown and we've gone from strength to strength since the relaunch. So we can only hope that it's upwards from here and expansion in all areas. Could you talk about the support services available in the community for our children, and how does Balit fill that gap?
Look, often other support services, especially regional or remote, despite being well-intentioned, are actually not culturally safe or trauma-informed. And trauma is a challenge that can't necessarily be overcome, but has to be addressed and managed in a way that facilitates healing and resilience. Having trauma-informed support services, not just in a legal space, but within other services like residential care, is vital for our kids' resilience. For example, last year, Balit Ngulu was contacted about a young person aged 16 who had matters before the court that they hadn't yet appeared for. Balit obviously appeared for the young person to oppose an application for a warrant and advised the court that Balit has the facilities to locate and engage with the young person. An adjournment was thankfully granted, and we're able to actually work with another local ACO to locate and engage with the young person. We made inquiries about youth intervention services that were available in the region and were advised that young person was not eligible for any of those services, believe it or not. That was naturally very alarming to VALS as the young person continued to be incredibly vulnerable, facing homelessness and lack supports. We had an ACE worker, thankfully based in the region that the young person was in, who performed all of the outreach and all of the engagement. Our solicitor regularly caught up with the young person, providing them with lunch on all of the locations, things like even clothing for a funeral that the young person had to attend, and sadly, even a jumper for the winter weather, because this young person had nothing, literally nothing. We also provided them with a mobile phone and phone credit so that thankfully we could contact them, but they could also contact their family and loved ones. The solicitor also made the relevant referrals for education to get the young person re-enrolled in education. The young person continued to engage with Balit Ngulu and with transport support from Balit Ngulu, attended court on all the occasions since the first contact. It's been over 6 months and that young person has not had any further contact with the criminal legal system. Now, you might think that's exceptional. Like, that doesn't happen every day, but that's exactly what Balit does day in, day out for all of the kids that they help. So those are the gaps that I think it's really important that we do. We also, if you look at it, provide important policy and advocacy in areas that often go unnoticed. Things like diversion for our clients. Often enough, there's a cohort of clients aged 18 to 21 who are most vulnerable in need of diversion, but actually struggle to access legal representation. For example, last year we had a vulnerable 18-year-old client who was granted diversion in Magistrates Court for 2 matters, one being the result of an alleged family violence incident with their mum. We flagged the young person's commencement of diversion, which postdated the incident, and the young person's recent support from the Aboriginal community engagement worker at VALS. When the prosecution were first approached regarding diversion, they didn't consent. However, Balit linked that young person up with community supports, particularly another ACO. We also provided things like food relief and material assistance by providing both the young person and their mother with, things like Dreamtime tickets to the AFL, things that they could do to build their relationship and connection. The young person continued to be assisted by Balit Ngulu in obtaining their birth certificate to set up Centrelink. They've since moved into state to restart their life with their partner. But if you think about the things that really made a difference in those case studies, it was being connected to supports, making sure that, they had housing, they were clothed, they had a means to be contacted by and to make contact with other people. But most of all, they had somebody who cared about what they wanted and they needed, and they supported them to achieve those goals.
Thank you, Nerita. I think it's so important, particularly, this is just 2 case studies out of, hundreds of kids that we've assisted, and particularly with the first one that you spoke about, if Balit wasn't there and if Balit didn't give an undertaking to the court, take those extra steps, to reach out to other community ACOs, that young person would have had a warrant. That young person would have spent time in the police cells. That young person may have ended up in Parkville, and they would have been none the wiser that they even had court. So the extra mile is absolutely necessary. And, you've in both of those case studies, it really highlights the need for Balit Ngulu and like Meena mentioned, best practice. It really is. It's different to the way that others operate, but it is best practice. So Nerita, could you speak about how Balit Ngulu goes to great lengths to advocate for community-based interventions for our clients?
Sure, Negs. Look, there are many instances where Balit has stepped in and advocated for community-based outcomes for clients. And it's worrying to imagine the overpunishment of our kids in the absence of a service like Balit. Whilst there are many examples, I'm going to take you to just the one given time. In the case of Murray, an 18-year-old Gunai-Kurnai man who was refused bail at the Magistrates Court, Balit listed a bail application to be heard in the Supreme Court. The young person had been exposed to immense amounts of childhood trauma involved with child protection since he was only 12 months old and had over 15 placement changes during his childhood. That's 15 new homes, 15 new starts, 15 broken connections. Balit knew that custody would not be a rehabilitative environment for this young person. He needed positive community supports to be connected to culture. We pushed for an opportunity for the young person to rehabilitate themselves in the community. The court found that the risks of incarceration might further alienate him from his culture. His case highlights the importance of considering an accused Aboriginality in determining whether to grant bail. Despite some recent reforms to Victoria's bail laws, as I said, the Victorian government backflipped on a promise to remove reverse onus provisions for kids. Probably not only backflipped, they did like a little mini performance of acrobatics to get there. Reverse onus provisions are incredibly harmful. They actually force an individual to prove why they should be on bail, rather than the prosecutor and police having to prove why they should be deprived of their liberty. This has meant that a significant number of people being deprived of liberty who have never been found guilty of a crime. It was these provisions which led the Victorian coroner to refer to the Bail Act as a complete and unmitigated disaster, and they are responsible for driving a huge increase in the prison population of Victoria. While VALS wanted the reverse onus provisions removed entirely for adults and children alike, the Victorian government's promised position would have helped get many children out of a lifelong entanglement in the criminal legal system, enabling them to get the supports that all children need to give them a chance to build a better life, one that isn't in a cell, one that is out in community where they can be supported, they can be loved, and most of all, they can make positive contributions back. If you'll entertain me for a second, Negs. There's also another example which is really important, which was that Victoria had signed up to a decriminalisation framework for children in care. And it was pretty, it was a beautiful document, lovely design. Do you think that one bit of attention had been paid into how to implement that? Nada. Victoria Police, DFFH, so many people were signatories to that agreement, but not one of them was making sure it was enforced. But we did. As soon as we became aware of it, we started pushing for our clients to have benefits of that framework to make sure they weren't being criminalised in care for things like taking food from a pantry because they were hungry. Things like spilling milk, which, as a mother of 2 young boys, might I say, if you give them a drink, they are likely to spill it. I have sacrificed many a couch, many of a cushion to that cause. I certainly wouldn't be charging them. Instead, what I would be doing was making sure that we're supporting kids. We're letting them make mistakes because that is how they learn. So that is one example, I think, where we were really pivotal, Ned, because without us, nobody would have paid attention to that framework. Nobody would have made sure that residential care providers were aware of it. Nobody would make sure the Victoria Police were aware of it and being held to it.
You're bang on with that one. I think it came as quite a surprise to them when we escalated the lack of implementation of a, like you said, a beautiful framework. And I'm very proud of the work that Balit did with that. Beautiful. So that brings us to the end of my questions for our wonderful panelists. I can see that we've got quite a few questions in the Q&A. We have about 5 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes. So I might go through the Q&A and we'll try to answer most of them live. If we don't get to any of the questions live, we will be able to type out an answer for you. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. As a legal organisation, if you were able to get one unlimited vital resource for young people, what would it be? And what would be a vital resource that you would like to be offered more for parents and community? Who would like to answer that?
From my perspective, we do need to change the investment triangle. So rather than investing the most in carceral responses, we should be investing the most in early intervention approaches. So making sure that we're supporting children and families before they even get to the end of criminal interaction. That means making sure that we invest more in housing, we invest more in healing services, more in health services. And I cannot underscore enough the need for appropriate funding for disability and mental health. Over 87% of VALS clients have identified they have a diagnosed mental health or disability. And we've also seen alarming suicide data, which indicates that we've seen an increase of 75% of Aboriginal self-harm and suicides in the last 2 years. And a vast majority of those had contact with the justice system in the 72 hours prior to that attempt or death. So for me, those are that's the priority. Let's take all the money, out of the prison system and let's put it into diversion and early intervention.
I can't agree more. I always find questions like this difficult to answer because it is such a holistic response that Aboriginal practice, ways of doing calls for, that it's not just one thing, it's a whole myriad of things and everything is connected. But absolutely, the criminal legal system, child protection systems, they're systems of last resort. So we need to absolutely front end prevention and early intervention. And the things that work, if you want evidence of the things that work to keep children safe with families, to keep children away from the criminal legal system, just look at any child who isn't in any of those systems. And I often use myself as an example. All the things that kept me with my family, that kept me out of the criminal legal system, are all the things that most of us take for granted, but for Aboriginal community are the very things that were attacked and tried to be destroyed through colonisation. So you put investment into those very basic things that we all need to thrive and survive. I honestly think we need Maslow's hierarchy tattooed on everyone's foreheads so that people know what they need to invest in. Safe home, food, supports, all of those basic things need to be addressed before you can move on to anything else. And I just find it astounding that, when it comes to things like public housing, we have the wait lists that we have into years. It's just ridiculous. So absolutely agree with Nerita. Prevention and early intervention measures.
Thank you both. I might skip a couple of questions. We actually have quite a few, so we'll try to pick out a few that we can answer in the last 7 minutes. Nerita, why is funding not going beyond this June, please? That's a question from Stephen.
Not a problem. So, Stephen, the Victorian government provides funding for limited times, usually between 3 or 5 years. So, Balit coming to the end of its 3-year agreement. As such, we have not been notified whether or not funding will continue beyond that point, or whether or not it will expand to cover off the areas of the state that we just unfortunately can't get to with our current resource constraints, or move back to its original positively evaluated model of providing services to the family division of the Children's Court as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
And if you want to bother somebody about Balit Ngulu funding, which I encourage all of you to do, I want you to email the Attorney General, and thankfully we've put her details in the chat. Might I also say that you reach out to the Minister for Children, which is Lizzie Blandthorne, as well as obviously the Minister for Youth Justice, which is Minister Ergodon, and tell them that you want them to fund Balit Ngulu to continue to provide positive outcomes for Aboriginal kids.
What, if any, preventative support might be available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, and particularly children, to avoid getting into a situation where they need legal representation to support them to navigate changes or the justice system?
I think it's exactly as you say, Noella. It's preventative support. It's those supports that meet children and young people where they are. I'm a firm believer that you need to build relationships before the need arises. So we need to make it safe for families, for children and young people to raise any sort of issues that they're having, any concerns or challenges. And we need to make it easy and safe for them to do that so they can get the support that they need. So, everywhere that children are, so schools are obviously a really important place. I'm just reading the questions, and I see that there's another question a bit further down from Christine about a school that has a crew club and a whole lot of support staff and everything. They're great ways to start, but it's about, when it comes to education, it comes to schools, every space in a school needs to be inclusive. I hear some great examples of supports being put in place for crew kids, whether it's going on excursions or it's meeting, or providing a safe space or these sorts of things. But it's often in addition to, rather than actually addressing the school environment in and of itself. So, we talk about cultural safety places. Schools are required to comply with child safe standards. Child Safe Standard 1 is about creating culturally safe environments for children and young people, Aboriginal children and young people, to address racism. We need to see that happen in every single space. It can't just be, say, a separate space where a separate room, where that's the only place that an Aboriginal child feels safe in the school, in that room. They need to feel safe in their classrooms, in the playground, everywhere they are. Similarly, when they go and get supports from services, from health services, from wherever. One of the things I see in my job is a complete lack of services that respond directly to a child or a young person. Often, and this is particularly in the case of family violence, but it happens in other areas as well, is that we see children and young people as often as not necessarily victims in their own right, but as an extension of an adult victim, and that services aren't being tailored specifically to what children and young people need. So we need to review what our services are doing to make sure that they're being delivered in a way that addresses children and young people, that sees them, that uses communication, that engages with them on that level, on their level, that understands what it is that they want, that is trauma informed, but understands, you know, this is why a child might react to a situation. This is why a child is behaving in this way. That understands that trauma can have a huge impact on how children make decisions and how they develop. Even without trauma, there's evidence that children until the age of 14 don't have those skills, those capacity yet to make those decisions and think through about consequences of things. So we really need to see services that are tailored to the needs of children and young people. For Aboriginal children, obviously that needs to be culturally safe services. We just don't have enough of those services funded, especially in regional and remote areas. Like Nerita said, we have to absolutely front end all of those services so that we're not getting to a point where child protection or the criminal legal system has to step in.
Thanks, Meena. Nerita, did you want to add anything?
No, couldn't agree more with Commissioner Singh.
We might just answer one more question. There's a question actually that says, are teachers required to undertake cultural safety training? I would hope so, but I actually don't have the answer to that.
They are. So I mentioned child safe standards. Child safe standards apply not just to schools, they apply to basically anywhere where children and young people are getting services. You go to the dentist, where they play sport, where they practice religion, hobbies, all sorts of spaces where children and young people are. Child Safe Standard 1 is around culturally safe spaces for Aboriginal children and young people. It's a legal requirement that child safe standards are implemented. Schools, so there's government schools, there's religious schools, there's independent schools, there's a whole regime of different schools. The government schools, I always forget what the acronym stands for. It's CUST training. I think it's cultural understanding and central sensitivity training. I think, don't quote me on that. But that's being rolled out across schools everywhere. But as you can imagine, not one training session doesn't undo potentially a whole lifetime of learning and living in this country, which, parades negative attitudes about Aboriginal people. So it's a necessarily ongoing process, dismantling of racist ideas and attitudes. And it's a constant challenging for non-Aboriginal people to really be looking at what are their attitudes and what are their biases when it comes to educating Aboriginal kids, when it comes to educating about Aboriginal history. I've heard some shocker stories from Aboriginal children and young people about experiences in the classroom. Our recent systemic inquiry, Let Us Learn, looked at experiences of children in out-of-home care, of education. But when I spoke to Aboriginal kids, any Aboriginal kid, whether they were in care or not, their experiences of racism in education was huge. So community would tell us, I would tell you, that any training that is mandated at the moment is simply not enough.
Thank you, Meena. Nerita, did you have anything you wanted to add to Meena's comments?
Everything that Meena said is correct. I think the one thing that was startling for me is that recently Mateo started school, and prior to this, Mateo being at Bullet Willem, which is an Aboriginal childcare and kindergarten, and came out with a certain frame of mind from that early childhood experience. And for him, going into a mainstream school was really alienating and really scary because he didn't know what they knew about his culture, didn't know if they would respect that. And the KESO has been really integral, as well as the Bullet Willem transition coordinator, in providing that learning to the school, who put their hands up and said, look, we don't know, but whatever you can point us to, we're ready to learn. And I think that that's great that we can have those schools who do that. But I also know in Echuca, for example, we have schools who are perpetrating the worst kind of racism on our children, putting them at risk. So it is a really mixed bag, and it does really require us tackling all forms of racism, including the institutional in systems like education.
Thank you, Nerita. I might just quickly answer Christine Morris. Do you work with local community centres and neighbourhood houses? Is there a role for them to collaborate with you? My view is that there might be. yes, we're never closed off to any collaboration. That might mean that young people who perhaps don't know about us might have access to our service. It would just be really a conversation that we would need to have and see what our respective roles could be in a collaboration. I don't know, Nerita, if you wanted to add anything to that, or Meena?
Just that collaboration is limited by resources. And at the moment, we are operating on a very, very thin line. So should resources become available, then we can really look at creating those localized partnerships like we have in our hub spaces, where we've been able to pair with ACTROs and ACROs as well as mainstream orgs.
Definitely. All right. Well, a big thank you to our panelists today. They've given us plenty to reflect on, both in the discussions and in the Q&A. And thank you to everyone who's joined us in the audience today as well. It's so encouraging to see so many people engaging in such an important topic. I'd like to leave you on a final note of, if you want to support the work that Balit Ngulu does, you can make a donation at vals.org.au/donate. You can also email or write to your local MP asking them to consider extending the funding for Balit Ngulu, because every young person deserves to have access to a service like this. And just a reminder of the details that we provided at the start of this webinar. If today's discussions have raised any issues or concerns for you, we encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to call Yarning Safe and Strong, and anyone can call Lifeline on the details in the chat. Please take some time over the next week to reflect on the things we've discussed today and how you can support Aboriginal communities and pressure government to ensure that services like Balit Ngulu are well resourced. I hope that the stories and the insights shared today stay with you well beyond this hour webinar. And I encourage everyone to continue to reflect on how we can make a difference, both individually and as a community. How can we ensure that every young person has the opportunity to thrive, to fulfill their potential, and to become the strong voices of tomorrow? Thank you so much for your time, and have a great afternoon.